What is up, everybody? Come on, man. Come on. Yes! This side of the room is on fire this morning. I've been standing in front of you all morning. It's been awesome. Hey, I'm so excited that you're here. If this is your first time today, my name is Josh, one of the guys on the team. And my job today is just to tell you, you don't have to be lonely. That's it. Wherever you are in your story, you don't have to be lonely. And the reality is in my role, a lot of people just assume that I'm not lonely. That I am like super connected and like my life is a you know kind of grand central station of relationships, and that's just not the reality. And so if you walked in here today and you're carrying this big, deep, giant desire to be connected relationally with people, that is possible. And if you're somebody who's like, man, I've never even said it out loud, I've never said that I'm actually lonely, but I really am, and that kind of strikes a chord with me, then kind of lean in today. And so if something like presses upon you that's like, I don't like that, stay with me, all right? We're going to get to the end, and there's going to be a little bit of a resolution, but we're going to point towards Jesus, and we're going to point towards a solution towards loneliness in our lives. And I just want to like say this has been like framed up for me in my heart for a really, really long time. And I've gone through a lot, you know, I may only be 34 years old, but I've been through a lot of valleys and a lot of mountaintops and back into the valleys and back up the top of the mountaintops. And I just want you to know, like, if you are lonely today and if you're watching online, there is hope. So I'm going to read this verse and we're going to welcome everybody in online. I love this. This is David writing in his journal. What dude writes in a journal? Only the cool dudes write in their journal, all right? So if you are a dude, get a journal and start writing in your journal. All right, here we go. This is so beautiful. Like David, a man after God's own heart. This is like, what do you say? What do you say when you're that guy, okay? God will not forget the needy, nor the hope of the afflicted ever perish. Like those of us who feel like we're in need, like, well, you walked in here, you came in here, you found the courage to come in here, like my friend Mark with a wig on over here that's like really keeping me on my feet this morning. Maybe you came in here and your need is like, it's invisible. Maybe your need is kind of like, nobody would ever know, and I would never even say it out loud, and there's nobody on earth that would really even share my need. And David says, but listen, like, God's never going to forget you. Like, you aren't alone. That is like the beauty of this is like, because of Jesus, even when we feel alone, our feelings betray us, the heart is deceitful above all things, we are not alone even when we feel alone. The hope of the afflicted never perish, which means like there's never going to be a day in your future where it's like, sorry, there's no more hope for you. David says, listen, the needy will not be forgotten, nor the hope of the afflicted ever perish. You ever felt like afflicted before? I mean, like afflicted in regards to, like, you are down to your last cherry Coke. You know what I'm saying? And you take the cherry Coke and you put it into, like, the secret compartment of the refrigerator, the compartment where, like, the little hands can't reach their compartment. And then later on, you just so happen to walk into a room and you see the little hands around a cherry Coke can, and you think to yourself, yeah, there's no more hope for that one. You know what I'm saying? You ever been there? Hey, if you're here and you're watching online, we don't want to get too far. It's kind of weird, like not saying hey to you and welcoming you into your room. We have some friends that are watching right now from Lisbon, Maine, and Rutland, Vermont. Would you guys put your hands together and welcome them in this morning? Yeah. So one day when people from Massachusetts watch, we'll greet you, but until then, we're going to ignore you, Massachusetts, all right? So we're in this series called How to Neighbor. We don't have to neighbor Massachusetts. That's just the deal, all right? Unless you're wearing a jersey, I think that's how this thing works, all right? And so we've talked a little bit over this last month about racial reconciliation and orphans being embraced and the poor being empowered and widows being included. And today we're talking about the lonely being loved. And many of us, like we would never really even think about this, but we live in a world. And I'm really fascinated by these two words, especially when you put them together. They are these words, relational poverty. And I just want you to think about that for a minute. Like we usually don't have time to sit and think, but I just want you to think. What comes to your mind when you hear the words relational poverty? So I asked myself this question this week, like, who struggles with relational poverty? You know, like who do you think? Who would you put in the blank? Who struggles the most? You like older adults, widows, people who retire. They're not working anymore. They're not around people. The reality is like everybody. The reality is that like every single one of us wish we had somebody who knew us. Like my mentor told me this years ago, and I didn't believe him for a really long time because I have a hard time with authority, all right? And so just bear with me a little bit. And so he said, listen, to be deeply loved and not be fully known is artificial. And I was like, wait, what do you mean? Well, like Josh, here's the reality. Is to be deeply loved but not be fully known is to deeply love somebody who is not you. And I was like, oh. Okay, so to be fully known and deeply loved, there's nothing better. There is nothing better on this side of eternity than for somebody to fully know you, like the absolute worst version of you, no makeup, no formal attire, like the heart completely unzipped, and to say, well, I'm sorry, but this is me. Like for somebody to know that version of me and to love me no matter what, there is nothing better. And like my hope and our hope here at Movement and the hope of every single person in leadership is that every single person has a person. Every single person has a person that can know you fully and love you deeply. Like 603 means a lot of different things around here, but it is our hope that like the 0 in 603 is that there are 0 people within our relational hemisphere that are literally living in a lonely, isolated life. Like there are 0 people that are not in a circle. There are 0 people that are not in community. Like what is rampant right now in our world is loneliness and irritation and alienation. And we think that, for whatever reason, people are lonely because it's their fault and they don't care. Well, there's really not a lot of logic or stats to back up that. The reality is it's possible for you to come here and to be here every Sunday since January 1st of 2017 and sit in this crowded room and feel entirely alone. You realize that? And what do you do about that? What do I do about that? What do you do about it? What do I do about it? Well, like how do you allow people to know you? How do you allow yourself to be fully known and deeply loved? It's possible. Like in our worlds, like I talk to a lot of stay-at-home moms, and stay-at-home moms are with their babies all day, and they're lonely. They have a hard time. There are people that I'm friends with that work around a lot of people, and they would say, and they do say, that they don't have one single close friend that they can just drop their guard with. It is like our daughter who's in college that is surrounded by people all the time, all the livelong day. And the more you're surrounded with people and the less that you're actually to be fully known, you're like, I'm not deeply loved because nobody knows the real me. I have a friend who's a successful business leader, top of their game, the highest on the ladder they've ever been. And it's like, I never knew that whenever I got here, it was going to be so hard to relate and to connect with all of the people around me. Like you could be in a publicly wonderfully looking marriage, and behind closed doors it could be dysfunctional, and you could say, I just go to bed every single night and I feel alone and I know that it is not supposed to be this way. Whenever you hear the word relational poverty, most of us are like, that's not me, Josh. That's not me. And so I live in denial sometimes too. And the reality is I searched my heart and I like pressed in and said like, okay, like where am I? Like, how do we understand relational poverty? Like, a lot of us understand, like, financial poverty. It's realizing that somebody lacks a material wealth or the ability to meet daily needs, a lack of a support system. And so what it looks like for relational poverty is it's a lack of love, empathy, support, and somebody to listen and to share your story with. Like literally to share the story with. Like I have a friend who works in a crisis hotline, and they literally pick up the phone and answer as a volunteer, and people just need somebody to listen to them. That's it. And the reality is we live in a world where like the habits that you and I employ in our life can either build connection or they can reject connection. It's like it's one or the other. We can either ignore our own personal isolation, or we can intentionally pursue connection with one another. And so why is this? Why? I mean, we could talk about the why. Why do we live in a world where relational poverty is like one of the biggest deals right now? So there are 4 things that I put together pretty quickly. Number 1, I think it's the breakdown of families. It is a breakdown of families, Nobody stands up on their wedding day and says like, till death do us part, until like, we hit a financial crisis, or until, something in our life just completely implodes, or I lose a job, or somebody gets sick, or our car breaks down, or I have to eat Thanksgiving dinner with my in-laws and I borrowed money from them, and Thanksgiving dinner just tastes different whenever you owe your in-laws money. You know what I'm saying? Like, the breakdown of families just kind of pushes us towards this place of relational poverty. Like, to where, we could talk about that forever. We're not going to talk about the problem forever. Number 2, increased mobility. The reality is a lot of people travel, and many of you here in this place, like, we've had many people coming through movement over the last couple of years where they're literally here for 18 months, 24 months. And because of that, they enter that story to say, I'm not going to connect with anybody. And so, like, if I know I'm not going to be here long, I'm not going to go deep. That's what you're saying. Like, I want you to hear how foolish this sounds. Like, I'm not going to be here long, so I'm not going to allow anybody to know me. And so I'm not going to, like, connect with anybody else. And so I'm just going to be entirely cool, and I'm just going to accept I'm alone. The increased mobility is like, man, this could actually work in our advantage, but it's actually working against us right now. Number 3, heavy workloads. Like, we are working more than we ever have in our entire lives, and we continue to increase. Oh, I can do that. I can squeeze in 30 more minutes here, 30 more minutes there. Number 4, the rise of social media. This is the reality, is like what one pastor calls deferred loneliness. To where, like, I had this habit where I was like, why on earth do I feel like I have to continuously look at what everybody else is doing in their lives? Is anybody with me? Like, am I the only one here? Like, why do I have this feeling where I've got to be in the know about what everybody else is doing, where everybody else is going, what everybody else is eating, what everybody else is, like, where the apple orchard they're going to? Like, why do I care? Why do you care? Why? Well, because, like, we could talk about this for a really long time, but you can be aware and you can know somebody else's highlight reel, and then you just continue to suspend what's happening in the backstage of your life, and then you're like, nobody knows me, nobody knows my story, nobody knows what it's really like. And so we find ourselves in a place of relational poverty, and we're like, how do I get out of this? What do I do? What does the next chapter in my story look like? And this is really, 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 really hard. And so what do we do? How do we love the lonely? Like, for some of you today, you're like, well, that's me. We're talking about me today, and that is cool. We're talking about me, and I never thought, Josh, I never thought whenever I reached this point in my life, I never thought that I would be an adult, and like, I dreamed about this day for a really long time where I could give my parents the peace sign, drive out of the driveway, and I'm like, I don't need you. I don't need anybody ever again. And one day I woke up and was like, I kind of miss my mom and dad. Like, I kind of miss, like, having, like, a connection relationship and having positive relationships in my life, and I just don't know where I'm at right now. So this is where we're at. It's like, God, can you help us to see people that feel invisible? Can you help us to see people who feel forgotten? Can you help us invite people into our lives that feel like they're on the outside? There are 3 primary ways that we can do this. We can love the lonely, and the first one is found in Matthew chapter 8, and I just absolutely love this. Jesus is like sweating to death. He just got done teaching, and my imagination tells me his caffeine was wearing off, okay? Like, he was rounding third base, getting ready to come into the clubhouse, shower and shave and just get ready for the day. And while he comes off of the mountainside, there were large crowds following him. If you're with me, Matthew chapter 8. He came off of the mountainside, and all of a sudden, when you get done teaching, this is like where it all started. Like, when people come and talk to the preacher after, like, this is where it started, right here, Matthew 8. This was the very first time right here in the New Testament we see it. When Jesus got done teaching, all of a sudden, large crowds began to follow him, which is hilarious because you know how this started in Matthew chapter 5? Jesus saw the large crowds, and he sat down and began teaching his core group of people. So he's like teaching his core group of people. Well, then all of a sudden he wakes up and he's like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people out there. Like one of our modern day theologians would say, like, look at all the lonely people. And Jesus, Matthew, who gave up his life and was transformed by Jesus, like, kept his pencil and wrote down everything that happened. And he tells a story about what happened when Jesus came off the mountain. You're like, I'm not on the mountain right now. Well, that's good because Jesus didn't stay there for very long. So Jesus comes down off the mountain, and and then Matthew tells us this is what happens. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. We got to stop right here. like, you've got to be able to understand, like, what on earth happened in this world with someone with leprosy. Like, their internal organs were dying, and like, you know, on average, typically when somebody was diagnosed with leprosy, they literally had like a 10-year death sentence, and there was no way to stop and slow down the train. And as a matter of fact, like within religiosity, people with leprosy were literally like outcasts, and they were put outside. Nobody could go near them. Nobody could touch them. If you even got within a certain like radius of them, you were considered unclean, and you like got their uncleanliness on you, and then all of a sudden you were polluted. And you remember what James talked about a couple weeks ago? He's like, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, not just keeping yourself polluted from the world. Like he's like, you're gonna get messy. Like it's gonna be messy. So get ready for this. And so here is Jesus literally standing in front of a man that every other religious leader of this day would have stayed so far away from. Who do you think is the most lonely person in our world right now? Like within this world, it would have literally been like everybody knows that if you are leprosy, you have literally been given a life sentence of loneliness, and that is it. That is your punishment. And all of a sudden, this man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus, and he said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." What a heck of a sentence. Lord, if you're willing, you know what that says? Like, in other words, I know you can. Like, so if you're willing, could you make me clean? And Jesus did something. Jesus did something that caused every single person that had faith to stop and to pause. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. You know, most men in the room, like in terms of like love languages, the 5 love languages, almost every man I talk to, one of their top 2 is physical touch. This is a beautiful thing here. Jesus reaches out to the man and touches him. We see Jesus all throughout Scripture. He doesn't even have to physically be in the neighborhood, and he could just say it out loud, like, "Be healed," and all of a sudden, boom, they're healed. And Jesus like reaches, like Jesus is like, I'm going to touch somebody that nobody else wants to touch. Pay close attention. Jesus touches him, and he says, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of leprosy. And then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone." This is so cool. I love this. "But go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Like Jesus is like, listen, here's what's so cool. Because if I was Jesus, you know what I would do? Okay, go tell everybody. Go tell everybody that I touched you. Doesn't that sound weird? It's like, I don't know that, I mean, he touched me. Like there was like this really old hymn that was literally called "He Touched Me," and I thought, you know, man, for somebody on the outside, that kind of sounds really weird. That's like, let's just acknowledge that together, okay? That's like, he touched me. Yep, he touched me. Like that, like so without the context, we don't have understanding here, but the reality is Jesus did what nobody else who said they loved God was willing to do. Jesus literally went to a place that nobody else was willing to go. Like, and so what does this look like for us to love the lonely? It looks like loving with touch. And I would say, like, appropriately. Like, one of the things that would happen is religious leaders would literally, like, segregate and separate and isolate themselves from people who were in this position, so much so that if they even saw somebody with leprosy, they would scream out loud, "Unclean." They would rip their clothes. Like people who were dealing with leprosy, it was such an obvious thing. But for us right now, loneliness is just not obvious. Loneliness, like, we can have the appearance of connection, but the reality could be entirely isolation, and that's like freaking heartbreaking. And if you're here, like, I want you to know the needy will not always be forgotten, or the hope of the afflicted ever perish. Like, there is hope, and his name is Jesus, and it starts with him. And all of a sudden, I just kind of imagine, like, if you were Jesus and if I was Jesus, I would try to like build my following, right? Like, I want followers. Like, that's my thing, right? And so you do this really awesome thing. It's like a big day, a teaching day, you know, comes off the mountain and he heals this guy that nobody saw anything like this ever. Like when you're diagnosed with leprosy, it is fatal. Nobody could do anything with you. No surgeon would see you. No doctor would see you. You are done. D-O-N-E, done. And all of a sudden, Jesus walks into the story and everything has changed. And if I'm Jesus, here's what I'm saying. Wait. Skeptics in the room, I'm saying, hey, I'm Jesus. I healed you. Go tell everybody what I did. But Jesus is like, no, listen, I have a bigger story. You're not going to understand it right now, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to go and practice generosity because God's generosity literally showed up to you right now, and I only want you to tell the priests, okay? And I want you to offer this gift that Moses commanded, and this is such a beautiful thing. This is such a beautiful thing because, like, most of my life, you don't know this, now you do. You don't want to know this, but most of my life, like I'd probably say like upper 90% of my life is confidential. Like we deal with like the secret lives of American Jesus followers. And the reality is these priests did too. And so Jesus is like, here's the deal. Like I want you to go and tell them, I want you to go to tell them like what happened because maybe you've never had a conversation with a priest before. And so I'm going to relationally restore and end your relational poverty like right now. You know what happened? You know what would have happened for this man? Like his family would have never came close to him. His mom and dad would have looked at him, and maybe some of you have experienced that kind of relational rejection, like where you're like, I'm not really a leper, but that's the way my parents treat me, or that's the way that my sister or brother treat me, or that's the way my kids treat me, or that's the way that like people in my previous church treat me, or that's just the way that my neighbors treat me or don't treat me or whatever. And Jesus is like, hey, listen, like everything changes now. Like, so I imagine like, okay, so he went to the priest and he offered the gift, but where did he go next? My guess is he probably went home. Like, Mom, Dad, you're not going to believe this. Like, Jesus came. What did he do? What did he say? Like, you're not going to believe this. Like, he touched me. It would have literally turned everything upside down. And whenever we love people with touch, it could entirely turn life upside down. Several years ago, my father-in-law passed away, and he was like my hero, loved me like a son from the time I was 15 years old, punk kid. He should have never let me date his daughter, but he did, and he passed away, and I was just a total wreck. And a few of my friends, they were dealing with some really heavy stuff in their life as well. And they showed up at the hospital. There were no words whatsoever. Because what do you say to a pastor like when they're like in the valley? What do you say? They didn't say anything. They just hugged me for like what felt like forever, and I felt like the sun stood still, and I cried uncontrollably. And the reality is like they were the only people in my life. I had 3 people at the time in my life that I allowed myself to be fully known and deeply loved. In that moment, I just absolutely collapsed in their life. Like, who do you have in your life right now that you could turn to when you feel lonely? When you feel isolated, when you could say, like, I kind of feel like my life is kind of being put on pause right now, and I find myself drifting into a place where it's really not healthy. Like, who for you could do that? Who for you could walk alongside you when things get really, really heavy? I want to camp out here with two things. Two primary things here as we close. Number one, I think a lot of times like we're like, I don't even know what to do and I don't know what to say. So the second way we're going to love one another deeply is we're going to listen. We're just going to show up and listen. I think many of us, we listen with the intent to come back and like offer a solution. I think many times people want to be met in this place where they just want to be heard. And this is why I'm a really poor counselor, and I refer people to counselors all the time, because I'm a problem solver by nature, and so I have no problem acknowledging that. And so, like, when people are telling me their stuff, what I noticed myself over the last, I know myself pretty well. I've lived with myself for a long time, and I have a wife that helps me stay very aware of myself, all right? And so, when people are sharing their story, I'm like, man, I can listen to, 5-minute version of it, and I could figure it out. Like, I could tell you 2 things to do, and if I met with, a resistance of, nah, I don't want to do those things, I'm just kind of I don't know how I can help you here. And I'm reminded with, man, sometimes we love people just by listening. Like, one of my friends who's blown me away and inspired me more than maybe any human on earth has. Literally, their kid was doing an Eagle Scout project, and he was organizing and finding out kind of what the needs in the town were, and he was involved with Meals on Wheels. How many of you have heard of Meals on Wheels before? Yeah, Meals on Wheels is a big deal. And so they were organizing these meals and delivering, and there was a big kind of a gap, and so these 16-year-old kids are going around delivering Meals on Wheels. Is one of the most beautiful stories of all time. And my friend's son goes to deliver a Meals on Wheels meal, and he gets to this house, And this older gentleman who's a veteran is like, dropped off the meal, and he was like, would you just stay for a little while? And my friend's son was like, well, I've got this trunk full of meals I've got to deliver. And he was like, okay, well, I'm going to put this over here, and could you come back? And he was like, yeah. And so he gets in the car and he calls his dad and makes all the other deliveries. And he's like, Dad, this guy just asked me to come back, and like, I don't know what I should do. And I told him I was going to come back. And he was like, well, just like go back and keep the phone on speaker, and he's old, an older harmless man is not going to hurt you. And so he goes back and he's like, my favorite thing is the only time I ever talk to any person is when somebody brings a meal to my house through Meals on Wheels. It's the only time anybody ever talks to me. And this 16-year-old boy, who is pretty non-emotional in most regards, his heart was just like entirely ripped open. And he just showed up and he just listened. And I think many of us, like, do we listen to solve or do we listen to love? Like, I can't tell you how many times my wife, who is literally perfect, all right? I've verified this in lots of courts of law, okay? I can't tell you how many times where, like I'm listening and Jesse's telling me the thing and I'm like, oh man, I found the two things. Like really quickly, I found the two things that need to change, like right now. Like let's change these dudes right now. Like nobody drives around their car with like bald tires in the winter. You know what I'm saying? And so when you find out what the problem is, you're like, nobody's gonna do nothing, right? And so I'm like, I'm like the little kid who like, in class who always has something. And so like, and she's like, Josh, I just need you to listen. My mentor said, Josh, what if the reason you have no friends is because you're a bad listener? Youch. Yeah. Like friends on the other side of me, like, Josh, I feel like when we're talking, when you're here, like you're not really all here. The reality is that, yeah, that's true. There are moments there because I'm like a million miles down the road trying to solve other people's problems, like, mentally or whatever. And so we can love people by listening, not by solving, by acknowledging their pain and sitting with them in their suffering and empathizing and saying like, listen, I have no idea what it's like to have your last cherry Coke stolen from the fridge by one of your firstborn children. But, it's a big deal. Whatever the problem may be, you're like, I just don't know if anybody could really reach out and like touch this thing and provide any hope or healing or like really listen to my problem. I don't know if it's really going to fix anything. And every single time we come to this place and we're like, well, what do? We know that we need more relationships. So what do we do? And here's a pattern that I noticed happen in my life most recently, and I need to publicly repent.